This is the Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 216. Hey folks, welcome to the Smart Buildings Academy podcast, and this is episode 216. In this episode, we are going to be talking about creating your BAS standard. Before we do that, I want to talk about a couple things that are going on right now, just make you aware, and then we'll get into the podcast. So first thing I want to make you aware is that at store.smartbuildingsacademy.com. We are running our construction season closeout until the end of August. So you can save 20% off the cost of courses that you purchase using the coupon code AUG2020. Second thing I want to talk about is on September 2nd, we are going to be hosting a full day course, and that course is going to be on creating BAS standards. So what we'll do is that will be a small course of 10 people. So right now we have 2 signed up, so we have 8 more spots. And in this course, you and I and a small group of people will be going through creating a BAS standard for your organization. You'll be given the resources to create everything you need in regards to standards. You'll be given standard examples, and we'll talk through the process of creating a standard for your organization. This is an incredibly important topic. That's why we're spending this entire episode talking about it. So you can find out more information by going to podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/216. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/216. So in this episode, we are going to be discussing the purpose of a standard. We're going to talk about deciding where to store the standard, which a lot of people don't talk about, but it's incredibly important because it affects what you can do with your standard. We are going to talk about identifying the purpose for your standard and how it'll be managed. We're going to talk about creating the standard, how to create it, and the standard categories that you would find. All right, so first off, whenever you're creating a standard for your building automation system, you really should start off by identifying the purpose. Now, some folks are creating standards for construction purposes. Some folks are creating them for operational purposes. Some folks are creating them for maintenance purposes. And I do want to note that there is a difference between operations and maintenance, albeit it's a subtle difference. It is a difference, as you'll see as we move throughout the episode. So if you're dealing with a construction standard, that is typically going to detail out day one events. So things like, how are we installing the building automation system? How are we setting it up? How are we templating our graphics and our sequences? Whereas an operational standard is going to be more around, how do we operate the building? And usually this is more geared towards retrofit projects. And it'll be, hey, what are the standard graphics we need to set up on this existing system and moving forward on all of our tenant improvements? So it's a little nuanced there. And then a maintenance standard is more like an operations manual than a standard. And what it is it's more focused on common tasks that you perform. This is something I like to create with my customers back when I was doing service work, is I would work with them to create a BAS standard and then a BAS operational manual. And that ops manual would have common tasks that they would be performing. We would record videos of myself doing that or them doing that. And then we would document that and we would put steps in place, because honestly, and this probably wasn't the best business decision in the short term, but in the long term, it definitely was a really good business decision because it drove a lot of work to my company. But what I looked at as, man, I'm giving this person the system. I'm giving this group of people the system. I really want them to be confident in doing things like set point changes and things like graphics updates and being capable of doing that, and then turning to me for the integration work, the strategy work, the upgrades, things like that, the things that were complicated. And then their day-to-day tasks, they had a manual that they could follow to operate their buildings. Yeah, sure, I missed out on some PSA work, but my competitors never got in the door because I had such a tight relationship with people that I was able to go and really drive their business to another level by giving them, integrations that improved their tenant experience, by giving them strategies that improved the efficiency of both their equipment as well as their resource utilization, not just energy, but their team resource utilization, repair parts, etc. So understanding the purpose of the standard is really, in my opinion, where you should start. Once you understand that purpose, though, then you need to decide where the standard is stored. And this is something a lot of folks don't talk about, but it becomes increasingly important when you're utilizing maybe you're working with a multi-regional company or maybe a multinational company, and they have different standards depending on the country they're in or the state they're in, the region they're in. And understanding this allows you to do a very important concept called version management. So if everything is paper or it's a single Word doc and someone changes that, you do not have version management. And what that means is that you have no way of tracking what changes are made. You have no way of iterating from a base standard multiple regional standards. And so what I really want you to focus on are thinking of things like Google Docs, or my personal favorite, SharePoint, where you can do version management of Word. I personally prefer Word over Google Docs. It's just my personal preference, but whatever works for you. Either one allows version management, and it allows base templating. And what I mean by base templating is you have a base document, and then from that base document, you have duplicate documents that are basically child documents, and they inherit pieces of the main document. I know this is a little technical, and it's something I talk through when I do my live sessions helping companies build their BAS standards, as well as when we do our upcoming course. But understanding this, what it allows you to do is have this base standard, and then maybe you're modifying your sequence of operations because the sequence in Arizona is going to be completely different than Florida, maybe for outdoor air control, for enthalpy control, etc. And so your sequence standards would be different at the sub-level, but at the main level, your standard itself would be consistent. And this allows you to make changes at this top-level standard and then have these kind of regional standards make modifications to that top level standard without modifying it. I know that sounds a little circular logic and a little confusing probably for a Monday morning, but trust me, it's not that difficult to set up. And once you've got it set up, it really makes things nice. Now, for those of you who maybe have one or two buildings, you probably don't need all of that, and that's fine. And maybe you just use a Word doc. I still personally prefer using an online data store like Google Docs, like Amazon, or like Microsoft, in order to make sure that I have kind of a soft backup of my standard that's easily accessible. And, if something happens, it's not going to totally get destroyed. If someone wipes their computer or someone accidentally spills coffee on it, it's not going to go away. Now, the next thing up is to understand how we're going to manage the standard. So who's going to have oversight of the standard? In matrix organizations, this is typically multiple people. You may have an energy manager, you may have a facility manager, you may have a construction manager, and all of them may want to have input into the standard. So understanding who owns what sections, how they will be updated, and definitely having a purpose log a revision log that says, what was revised, who revised it, and really adhering to that revision log when changes are made. And maybe even having a process for evaluating changes. Maybe it looks like a simple board or a group or steering meeting, but steering committee, having that together is really going to help you to drive the standard to kind of be adopted and useful to multiple different working groups or business units within your company. So I really encourage you to do that. Whenever you use a standard and you create a standard, you really shouldn't be doing it from scratch. There's so many resources out there. And what I provide to both our consulting customers and to our students of our BAS Standards course is our standard template. And the important part of a standard template is that it's modular, flexible, easy to use, and easy to adjust. So I like to keep my standards modular so that each module or each category, whatever you want to call it, applies to only one piece of the standard. So for example, I've got it on my other screen right here. And if I scroll down and I look at under the BAS Standards category, there is a subsection called Installation Standards. And this covers specifically how the device will be installed, how it'll be wired, what color wire for the connections, how it'll be mounted, what kind of panel will be used, any network connections and how they'll be connected and provided, and how the controllers will be labeled. And you basically start to work on these little subsections, and these subsections stand alone. And why that becomes really important is where I tend to find that folks really struggle with standards is they create this giant like omnibus document and everything is intertwined. And so you make a minor change and then it becomes overwhelming to understand where you're making all these changes. So by modularizing it and separating these into subcategories and categories, then you are able to really work on it piecemeal and gradually create a standard. Because I feel that, well, I don't just feel it. I know from my experience doing consulting as well as doing these workshops that one of the biggest barriers to standard creation is this concern, this fear, this belief that you have to do it all at once, which couldn't be any further from the truth. Hey, you've got a tenant improvement coming up. Well, this might be a good time to work on your graphic standards and just create template graphics that you want people to use. And sometimes it's template graphics and it's like very prescriptive. It's going to be this exact graphic. Things are going to be placed exactly here. And sometimes it's an intent. It doesn't have to be perfect. And if you take one thing out of this episode, it would be that perfection is going to be your enemy of progress. Because the reality is, a lot of you listening to this, your customers or you yourself, if you operate a building, do not have a standard. And because you don't have a standard, any progress is improvement, right? So let's say that you get a naming standard and that's all you get. Well, you've already progressed past many customers who do not have a naming standard. And so you may be saying to yourself, all right, where do I start? How do I create this thing? What do I put into it? I'm going to cover that in a second, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into this concept of categorization, subcategories, and modular approach to standard creation. And the reason I want to dive into that is picture this, right? You have a company with, let's say 10 buildings, a big round number, right? 10 buildings, and each building has a different name for points. So some call them zone temp, some call them room temp. Some systems have space temp, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have to realize is that to you, the experienced operator or the experienced contractor, you may be able to initially rationalize and kind of figure out that zone temp, space temp, and room temp are all the same thing. But to the untrained operator, to maybe the maintenance person or the tenant who's utilizing these systems, that may not be clear. And so by simply creating a naming standard, you have provided clarity. You've provided one step closer to understanding. And so now when this operator, this engineer, this tenant, whoever goes to utilize the system, you only have to train them that space temp or zone temp, whatever you decide, is the measurement for an area's temperature. And you train them to look for that. So in reports, in graphic analysis, in looking at the system tree, whatever you decide, they only have to look at that. And so as you start to develop that naming standard and start to implement it throughout your organization, and I like to use naming standard because naming standard tends to be an approach that we can utilize that is very straightforward. It really doesn't provide much system impact. Renaming points, you can usually do that pretty easily. And by doing that, you have now created a standard on which you can train people. And then so every time they go to a building, no matter what the building is, it has the same naming so they know what to look for. As you extrapolate that further into standard graphics, standard sequences, standard parts, standard installations, you get to a point where you can train your tenants, train your customers, train your installers, train your operators. You can get all of these people on the same page, train them once, and then your project implementation costs are lower, your cost of maintenance is lower, your user experience is improved. So start with little pieces, gradually build them up over time, and usually what I recommend your guiding principle be, and a guiding principle is kind of it's like something that casts a shadow over the entire standard, and it's saying, this is the purpose. This is whatever we do in this standard, it is underlying going to be to achieve this guiding principle. So my recommended guiding principle for when you create standards is that the standard improves the ability to understand the system. And that could be understanding the system from an installation perspective. That could be understanding the system from an operations perspective. That could be understanding the system from an interaction perspective. But the underlying guiding principle is system knowledge, like understanding of the system. And once they understand that, then they're better able to utilize the system, install the system, execute the system, etc. Okay, I think you get the point now. So I'm going to hop off that soapbox and we're going to dive into the categories. And these are the categories I recommend, and this is the order in which I recommend them. So when I'm teaching folks to go and create their BAS standard for the organization, this is what I teach. So the first thing I recommend is how to use the document. And this is a kind of catch-all that says, this is how we want you to use the document. This is what we want you to be aware of. This is how you're going to fill this out. This is how you're going to do revision management, etc. So the next thing I recommend is that you have this general category. So that's category 1. And this is category 2, general category. And the general category exists to describe your standard, its purpose, how to update the standard owner, and the contact for the standard. So the first thing I recommend is the purpose of the standard. This can, and I recommend it is, usually a couple sentences. If you're going beyond a couple sentences, then you're probably overthinking it, and your purpose is not clear enough. Your purpose should be clear enough that it can be defined within a paragraph. If not, I would recommend you think about your purpose. Now, I know this kind of new agey, purpose and reason and all that stuff. I'm telling you, spend some time on this. I know it's not sexy. It's not like super fun, but having the purpose and getting everyone aligned on the purpose is really going to save you a headache. And it's really going to be a useful tool for conflict resolution because it will not fail, especially if you've got multiple different business groups or business units that are utilizing the standard and providing input to the standard, that their view of why this standard exists is going to conflict with yours or maybe just not be aligned. And having a purpose around the standard will provide that baseline alignment that everyone can agree on. Next is how to update the standard. This makes it very clear how we're going to update it, what the process is. Is it a submission process? Is it a peer review? What is the process? Finally, or next, you have the standard owner, and the standard owner is going to dictate out, who owns the standard, who ultimately has oversight, who has categorical oversight, those kind of things. And then finally, you'll have contact information for the standard owner. Especially in multi-region or multinational companies, it's very important to have contact information. That way because you may not even know who these people are. You may have never worked with them. The next category I like to look at is kind of this omnibus category called BAS Standards. And it is going to describe a large area of standards. It's going to go through installation, capacity, naming, trending, alarming, scheduling, etc. So the main focal points, and I'll be a little brief on these just because I don't want to turn this into a crazy long podcast episode. But I already described installation. It's all about how things get installed, usually on the physical installation. Capacity standards is a very important one, especially if you're going to do any tenant improvements or you plan on any expansion in the future. Having capacity built into your system is very important and will save you on retrofit costs in the future. Naming standards, I can't emphasize enough how important naming standards are. These drive almost all success in your building automation system installation and operation. Trend standards, this describes how trending data is going to be recorded and stored. Very important because trends are extremely useful, especially nowadays with COVID and IAQ. Trends are going to become even more important from a measurement and validation perspective. So let's make sure we get them right and we have context and proper trending when we set those up. Alarming and scheduling standards, those are equally important because this is going to dictate out how notifications of errors are messaged and how systems are occupied and scheduled. Then we move into project standards. So this is going to be things around commissioning. How is proper point-to-point functional test done? Then we move into warranty standards. This is all about how projects are going to be managed during the warranty phase, how all of that's going to be managed. And then we have training standards, which is going to be around how are the occupants and operators trained to utilize the system. And then we have documentation standards. The really nice part about this is if it's written properly in, kind of CSI format, at least for those of us in the States, it can then be directly imported into a specification and can be used to drive a specification for consistency. From there, we have device profile standards. This is something I like to do where I will say, okay, we have an air handler device, we have a rooftop device, we have a chiller device, we have a terminal unit device. This is what it's going to be. This is the sequence it's going to use. Here's its standard points. Here's its standard alarming, here's its standard trending, etc. And so that if you say, hey, I have 100 terminal units, 50 are reheat and 50 are cooling only, and I have, 2 mixed air units and 1 outdoor air unit, I'm just making up numbers here. But if you have that, you refer to these profile standards. They will have the standard for the sequence of operations, the standard for the point trending alarming. And so your contractors, especially if you work with the same group of contractors over and over again, can have programs and graphics and everything pre-developed. And that should significantly reduce the cost of installation and construction. Because if for every time I work on ABC company's business, I'm going to use this sequence and I'm going to use this points list, I'm going to use this trend and this alarm setup, then what that means is my cost of engineering, my cost of submittal creation, my cost of installation, my cost of programming, my cost of commissioning, all of that's going to go down because it's all going to be a standardized, repeatable set of deliverables. And you may be thinking, yeah, but we use multiple different engineers across the country. Well, that's why you drive them to utilize your standard. You push back when they're like, oh, we've got this super unique sequence of blah, 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 blah. And you're like, no, we're going to follow our sequence and we're going to follow our standards because now organizationally, you only have to have one training process to implement. You only have to have one parts list that you need to store for, excess parts in case of service and maintenance. You only have to train your tenants on how to use the system once. And the nice thing about this, properly implemented, you can do this across multiple different building automation systems. So you may have a Tritium system, a Distech system, a Siemens system, a Johnson system. But if you properly implement these device profile standards, while they'll look a little different, a little more nuanced in their programming and their UI, you can get them fairly similar, which will make your life so much easier. I have another category called BAS Sequence Standards, and this just expands upon the sequences that are used in the device profile standard. So I do mention that I do like to keep my standards separate and not interconnected. So this slightly violates that, But the reason I do this is so that if I have a commissioning or a consulting engineer, I can just pull this part out and give it to them so that they understand my expectation. Although in an ideal world, I would prefer them to use category 5, which is device profile standards. So that's up to you if you want to do that. Some organizations choose to do that, some don't. Next, we have the BAS Schedule Standards. This is describing our standard schedules for our spaces. So we have our space types and we have our schedules for our space types. Then we have our report standards. I highly encourage this. These are the standard reports that should be created. And when you're thinking about this, you want to think about what information do I need to drive the operation and success of my business. And that is what drives the report standards. It'll drive what kind of reports are created. Next up, we have category 9, which is integration standards. This lists out what the standard integrations you're going to use. The reality is, having done a ton of integrations, having personally managed the integration program at Johnson Controls, which is a really large integration program, and we did a lot of complex integrations, I will tell you that when you're developing integrations, if you develop standards, AV to lighting to BAS, or access control to BAS, or parking management to BAS, or healthcare information systems to BAS, whatever it is, you develop these standards and then you'll find that the data sets are pretty similar despite whatever manufacturer it is. And once you have the standard created, it makes the cost of integration design, implementation, and commissioning much lower. Then we move into BAS IT standards. This is going to detail out your policies for your IT organization. This will make working with your IT group much easier, both for yourself as well as for your contractors. And the really nice part about it, the reason I like doing this, is if you do this with like a director or VP of IT and you get this all aligned, then what happens is when your contractor or yourself are requesting IP addresses or requesting a virtual machine or requesting remote connectivity, as long as this is aligned with the IT policies for your organization, there should, in theory, be no pushback, because you are saying, hey, you know what? We are going to do what is the policy for you, Mr. IT Group and Mrs. IT Group. And we're going to say, this is what your policy is, and we're just following the policy. So I don't know why you're pushing back when we're doing exactly what you said we should do. And in my experience, that largely mitigates a lot of IT issues. And so I like to look at it from system administration perspective. I like to look at it from a network perspective. I like to look at it from a database perspective. And I like to look at it from a cybersecurity perspective. So all of that together enables me to really provide a good sight picture of what I want my system to look like, how I want my system installed, how I want it set up, how I want it executed. And I'm telling you, it does take some time to set up. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it doesn't. And it is a little bit of work up front. But if you set aside a little bit of time, like, you say, hey, 4 hours every month, we're going to work on this. And you start working on it within, 12 months, that's 40 hours. That's a full work week that you have invested into developing a standard. And I will tell you, many times when I do consulting engagements with companies, we're able to develop their standard within 2 to 3 working days, at least their version 1 of their standard, enough to be functional. So having 5 working days over the course of a year, you can actually go and develop some decent standards. So I would encourage you highly, follow this methodology, identify your purpose, implement your standard, work on it piece by piece, identify who owns what, and drive this standard creation. It will save you so much in dollars. It'll save you so much in time, and it'll save you so much in headache by making your system standardized, making it easier to install, easier to operate, and easier to support. So I really encourage you to check this out. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comment section, either below this podcast episode or below the video, depending where you're listening to this. And I really encourage you to go to store.smartbuildingsacademy.com. and check out our BAS Standards course that's coming up on September 2nd, as well as to take advantage of our 20% off course discount for the month of August 2020. You can find out more information about that at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/216. Thanks a ton and take care.